Manhattan, New York City. November 2024. The glass doors of Ashford Tower swung open with a whisper of engineered precision, releasing a woman into the chaos of midday Madison Avenue. Margaret Chun stepped onto the sidewalk in her charcoal Armani suit, her heels clicking against concrete still damp from morning rain. The air smelled of roasted nuts from a nearby cart, exhaust fumes, and money. Always money in this part of the city. She had 17 minutes before her next meeting. The acquisition of Bennett Technologies was nearly complete, 6 months of careful maneuvering about to conclude in a conference room on the 42nd floor. Her phone buzzed against her palm. Another congratulatory text from the board. Another reminder that she was untouchable. That was when she saw him. He sat with his back against the limestone facade of a closed boutique, 3 buildings down from her tower. A cardboard sign rested against his knees, the words barely legible in rain-smudged marker. His jacket was too thin for November, torn at the shoulder, and his hands were wrapped in fingerless gloves that had once been black but had faded to the color of city grime. A paper cup sat beside him, a few coins glinting at the bottom. Margaret's stride faltered for half a second before she corrected it. She had developed the urban skill of not seeing the homeless, the practiced blindness that let her pass by human suffering with her conscience carefully compartmentalized. But something about this man pulled at the edges of her vision. He was looking at her, not with the desperate, pleading expression she had learned to avoid, but with something else. Recognition. And in his dirt-stained hands he held a photograph. She told herself to keep walking. 17 minutes had become 16. The Bennett merger waited for no one, not even for ghosts, but her feet had stopped moving. The man stood slowly, unfolding from the pavement with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned to distrust comfort. He was tall, taller than she remembered, though the stoop in his shoulders tried to hide it. His face was weathered, lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping on concrete and waking to the indifference of passing strangers. But his eyes, God, his eyes were the same. He crossed the sidewalk toward her, weaving through the river of pedestrians who parted around him instinctively, as if poverty were contagious. Margaret's hand tightened on her phone. She could walk away. She should walk away. Call security if he followed. Pretend she didn't know him, didn't recognize the shape of his jaw beneath the beard, didn't remember the sound of his laugh before everything fell apart. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the street on him, see the broken capillaries in his cheeks. Close enough that she could see the photograph he held was protected in a plastic sleeve, edges worn from handling. The photograph was of 2 people standing in front of a small house with peeling blue paint. A younger version of herself, 23 years old with hope still bright in her eyes, wearing a sundress from Target and laughing at something outside the frame. And beside her, his arm around her shoulders, was a younger version of the man who now stood before her. Daniel Harper, the man who had once promised her forever. Neither of them spoke. Around them, the city moved in its relentless rhythm. A taxi honked. Someone shouted into a phone. A siren wailed in the distance. But in the space between Margaret Chun and Daniel Harper, time had folded back on itself. He opened his mouth, and she saw his lips form her name. Not Margaret, the name she used now, hard and professional and safe, but Maggie, the name she had left behind in a different life. She cut him off before the sound could reach her ears. "You have the wrong person." Her voice was ice. Years of boardroom battles had taught her how to weaponize her tone, how to dismiss and diminish with a handful of words. "I don't know you." His face crumpled, just slightly, a micro-expression she might have missed if she hadn't once known every line and angle of that face. If she hadn't once traced those lines with her fingers in the dark. "Maggie." He said it anyway, and the name hit her like a physical blow. "Please, I just need 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to explain." "I said you have the wrong person." She stepped around him, but he moved with her, not touching, not threatening, just desperately trying to stay in her line of sight. "I know what you think happened." His voice cracked. "I know what they told you, but it wasn't. Maggie, please just look at the picture. Look at what we were." Don't you remember? She looked. She couldn't help it. 25 years collapsed in an instant. The house with blue paint had been their first place together. A rental in Queens with a leaking faucet and radiators that clanged all night. They had been graduate students, both of them, her studying business at NYU, him pursuing architecture at Cooper Union. They had survived on ramen and ambition, making love on a mattress on the floor and planning a future that seemed limitless. The photograph had been taken by Mrs. Chen, Margaret's mother, during one of her rare visits to the city. It was the only time her mother had met Daniel, 3 months before she died of the aneurysm that no one saw coming. Before everything changed. I don't know what you want. Margaret's voice remained cold, but something in her chest was beginning to crack. But I suggest you move along before I call the police. You married him. Daniel's words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for decades. 6 months after I disappeared, you married Robert Chin, your mother's business partner, a man 40 years older than you. She had married Robert. Married him in a city hall ceremony with no guests, no flowers, no joy. Married him because the medical bills from her mother's death had crushed her, because she was drowning in debt, because Robert had offered her a lifeline that came with conditions. He needed a wife for appearances, someone young and presentable to revive his company's image. She needed survival. It was a transaction, clear and cold, and she had accepted it with the same pragmatism that now governed every decision she made. Robert had died 8 years later, leaving her his company and a fortune she had quadrupled through sheer will and calculated risk. She had become Margaret Chun, CEO, one of the most powerful women in New York. She had erased Maggie entirely. That's none of your business. She turned away again, and this time she meant it. But his next words stopped her. I never left you, Maggie. I was arrested. The sidewalk tilted. Margaret grabbed the railing beside her, the cold metal grounding her as the world threatened to spin. What? I was arrested. The night before I was supposed to meet your mother. The night before everything. His voice was raw. Someone planted drugs in my apartment. 2 kilos of cocaine. I spent 8 years in prison, Maggie. By the time I got out, you were already Mrs. Robert Chin. Already building your empire. I tried to find you, but you had disappeared into a different world. A world I couldn't reach. She turned slowly. Her throat was tight. That's impossible. The police came to my apartment. They told me you had left, that you'd taken money from our account and disappeared. They showed me withdrawal receipts. Forged. He took a step closer and she didn't move away. All of it was forged. I spent years trying to figure out who did it, why they did it. And then I learned about Robert Chin. About how he had been circling around your mother's business, trying to broker a merger. About how your mother refused because she didn't trust him. About how convenient it was that she died suddenly, and you were left vulnerable, alone, and in debt. Margaret's mind was racing. She had never questioned the story of Daniel's disappearance. She had been too destroyed by grief, too overwhelmed by the collapse of her life. The police had seemed certain. The evidence had seemed clear. And Robert had been there, offering stability when everything else was chaos. Robert, who had been her mother's business partner. Robert, who had wanted the merger her mother refused. You're saying Robert had something to do with your arrest? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying I don't know for certain, but the timing was too perfect. I disappear, your mother dies, you're left with nothing, and Robert swoops in to save you. He gets the business, he gets respectability, and you get to survive. But Maggie, you deserved more than survival. We deserved more. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him he was insane, that he was making up conspiracy theories to justify the fact that he had abandoned her. But looking at him now, at the way prison and homelessness had carved away everything except the truth in his eyes, she couldn't do it. Why now? She asked. Why approach me now, after all these years? He looked down at the photograph, running his thumb across the plastic, protecting their younger selves. Because I'm dying, Maggie. Liver failure. Maybe 6 months left, the clinic says. And I couldn't die without telling you the truth. Without you knowing that I never stopped loving you. That if I could have come back to you, I would have. The tears came before she could stop them. 25 years of grief that she had packed away, buried under ambition and success and the carefully constructed armor of Margaret Chun. It all came pouring out on a Manhattan sidewalk while strangers flowed past them like water around stones. She had loved Daniel Harper with the kind of love that only exists when you're young and haven't yet learned that the world breaks promises. She had loved him and lost him and convinced herself that she had moved on. But she hadn't moved on. She had just learned to walk with the weight of his absence. I looked for you. Her voice broke. After Robert died, when I had money and resources, I hired investigators. They found nothing. No Daniel Harper anywhere. I thought you were dead. I might as well have been. He smiled sadly. I came out of prison to nothing. No degree, no prospects, no family. I tried to rebuild, but you know how it is. Ex-con trying to find work in this city. I slipped through the cracks. Fell all the way to the bottom. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since he'd approached her. Saw the broken teeth, the yellowed eyes, the tremor in his hands that spoke of malnutrition or addiction or both. This was what the world had done to the man who had once drawn blueprints for buildings that would touch the sky. This was what happened to people who fell through the cracks of her perfect, polished city. Her phone buzzed. A reminder that her meeting was in 10 minutes. The Bennett merger. The culmination of months of work. The next step in her unstoppable rise. She looked at the phone, then at Daniel, then at the photograph he still held. Come with me, she said. He blinked. What? Come with me. Now. She grabbed his arm, felt the boniness of it through the thin jacket, and began walking. Not away from Ashford Tower, but toward it. Maggie, I can't. Look at me. They won't even let me through the door. They will if I tell them to. She pulled him forward, her grip firm. I'm not leaving you on the street, Daniel. Not again. Not when I finally know the truth. The security guard at the door of Ashford Tower looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to concern as he registered Daniel's appearance. Margaret cut off his objection before he could voice it. He's with me, Thomas. We're going to my office. Thomas hesitated for only a second before nodding. When Margaret Chin gave an order, people obeyed. It was one of the perks of being untouchable. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent. Daniel stood in the corner, trying to make himself small. His eyes wide as he took in the polished brass, the mirrors, the digital display that showed their rapid ascent. Margaret watched him in the reflection and saw herself through his eyes. The woman who had replaced Maggie. The woman who belonged in elevators like this. Her assistant looked up as they entered the executive suite, her professional mask slipping for just a moment at the sight of Daniel. Reschedule the Bennett meeting, Margaret said without breaking stride. Tell them I have an emergency. Offer them dinner at Le Bernardin. My treat. But Ms. Chun, they're already... Reschedule it, Emily. She led Daniel into her corner office, shut the door, and locked it. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows showed Manhattan spread out below them, a kingdom of glass and steel that she had conquered. From here, the streets where Daniel slept were invisible, hidden by perspective and height. She gestured to the leather sofa against the wall. Sit. He obeyed, moving carefully, as if afraid the furniture might reject him. She went to the bar in the corner, poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, and brought it to him. He took it with shaking hands. Drink, she said. Then, more gently, please. He drank. The whiskey seemed to steady him, or maybe it was just the act of being treated like a human being. When he lowered the glass, he looked at her with such naked vulnerability that it hurt. I don't understand what's happening, he admitted. She sat in the chair across from him, maintaining the distance, not ready yet to fully close the gap between who they had been and who they were now. I'm trying to figure that out myself. She folded her hands in her lap, a gesture of control that was entirely Margaret. Tell me everything, from the beginning, the night of your arrest, everything you remember. So he told her. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if a dam had broken. He told her about coming home to their apartment in Queens to find police waiting. about the search that uncovered drugs he had never seen before, about the lawyer he couldn't afford who advised him to take a plea deal rather than risk trial, about 8 years in Rikers Island, learning to survive in a world where architecture degrees meant nothing and every day was a test of how much humanity you could preserve. He told her about getting out with nothing, about trying to find her and discovering she had married Robert Chin just months after his arrest, about assuming she had moved on, that whatever they had shared hadn't been strong enough to survive his disappearance. He hadn't known about her mother's death, about the debt, about the impossibility of her situation. All he knew was that the woman he loved had married someone else. He told her about the descent, the way jobs dried up when background checks revealed his record, the way apartments disappeared when landlords learned about his past, the way friends and family faded away, embarrassed by his presence, uncomfortable with his need, the slow slide from working day labor to sleeping in shelters to living on the streets. And he told her about the photograph, how he had kept it through everything, protected it, looked at it on the nights when he needed to remember that he had once been someone worth loving. By the time he finished, the sun had shifted in the sky, painting the office in amber light. Margaret hadn't moved. She had listened the way she listened in board meetings, with total focus, processing every word, every implication. "I need to see the court records," she said finally. "The arrest records, the trial transcripts, everything. I have lawyers who can pull them." "Why?" Daniel's voice was tired. "What difference does it make now? It's been 25 years, Maggie. Robert is dead. Even if he did set me up, what's the point of knowing?" She leaned forward, and for the first time since he had approached her on the street, she let him see past the armor of Margaret Chen to the woman underneath. "The point is truth," she said. "The point is that I built an empire on a lie. I married a man who might have destroyed you to get to me. I spent 25 years believing you abandoned me when you were fighting to survive. That matters, Daniel. That changes everything." He studied her face, and she saw the moment he recognized something of the girl he had loved beneath the polished exterior of the woman she had become. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to stay here. I'm going to have Emily book you a hotel room, a real room at the plaza. I want you to eat, sleep, shower. Tomorrow I want you to see my doctor. Get checked out properly. Then we're going to figure out what happened 25 years ago, and we're going to get you the help you need. I told you I'm dying. Liver failure isn't always a death sentence. Not if you have access to the right treatment. Not if you have money." She stood, and this time when she looked down at him, it wasn't from a position of power but of determination. "You said you came to tell me the truth before you died. Well, I'm not letting you die, Daniel. Not until we've had time to figure out what truth means for both of us." She picked up her phone and called Emily. Within 20 minutes, a car was arranged, a hotel room was booked, and Daniel was standing uncertainly in her office, the photograph still clutched in his hand. "Take it with you," she said, gesturing to the picture. "Keep it. It's yours." He shook his head. "It was always ours." He set it carefully on her desk. "Maybe it still is." After he left, escorted by her driver to the plaza, Margaret stood at her window and watched the city darken. Somewhere out there, in a hotel room that cost more than most people made in a month, Daniel Harper was probably standing in a hot shower for the first time in who knew how long, letting the water wash away the accumulated grime of years on the street. And in her office, surrounded by the trophies of her success, Margaret Chun picked up the photograph and looked at the two young people who had once believed that love was enough. The next 3 months became a study in redemption and revelation. Margaret's lawyers pulled the court records and found exactly what Daniel had described: an arrest that had proceeded with suspicious efficiency, a public defender who had barely mounted a defense, evidence that had appeared almost too perfectly. But they also found something else: a notation in the prosecutor's file about an anonymous tip that had led to the raid. A tip that had come from a burner phone purchased 3 blocks from Robert Chen's office. It wasn't proof, not the kind that would hold up in court. But it was enough for Margaret. Robert had destroyed Daniel to clear his path to her mother's business. To her. And she had never known. While the lawyers investigated the past, Margaret focused on the present. Daniel's medical evaluation revealed that his liver damage was severe but not yet irreversible. With proper treatment, medication, and time away from the street, there was hope. She put him on her company's insurance, arranged for a specialist, and rented him an apartment in Brooklyn. Nothing too fancy. Daniel had made it clear he wasn't comfortable with charity, only with a chance to rebuild. She visited him 3 times a week. First, it was awkward. They were strangers who had once been everything to each other, and 25 years was a chasm that couldn't be crossed in a day. But slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about the past, not yet, but about smaller things. Books they had read, places they wanted to visit, the way the city had changed. Daniel started attending AA meetings, not because he had a drinking problem, but because he had learned on the streets that addiction came in many forms, and the meetings gave him a community, a structure, a reason to keep showing up. He got a part-time job at an architecture firm, doing basic drafting work. The owner was a friend of Margaret's, and yes, she had made the introduction, but Daniel's work was his own. His hands remembered what his mind had never forgotten. And Margaret started remembering too, started allowing herself to feel the grief she had bypassed 25 years ago. She had mourned Daniel's absence but never his loss, had moved forward without processing what she had left behind. With a therapist's help, she began to unpack the ways that survival had cost her, the ways that Margaret Chun was both a triumph and a prison. 3 months after their reunion on the sidewalk, Daniel invited her to dinner. Not at a fancy restaurant, but at his apartment in Brooklyn. He cooked, a skill he had learned from YouTube videos and patient practice. Pasta with marinara sauce, a salad, garlic bread. Simple food made with care. They ate at his small table by the window, watching the sun set over the city. And for the first time in 25 years, they talked about the photograph. "I used to think about what we would have been," Daniel said, twirling pasta on his fork. "If none of it had happened. If I hadn't been arrested. If you hadn't married Robert. I used to imagine us in that house in Queens, or maybe something bigger. Kids, maybe. A dog. The whole suburban dream. I used to think about it too," Margaret admitted. "Especially in the early years with Robert. He was never cruel, but he was never kind either. It was a business arrangement that we both understood. And I told myself that was enough. That stability was enough. That I didn't need love because I had already had it and lost it. Do you think we can have it again?" The question was quiet, almost hesitant. "Or are we too different now? Too broken?" She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were still rough, still bore the marks of years spent surviving, but they were steadier now. Healing. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know if we can go back to being Maggie and Daniel. Those people don't exist anymore. But maybe Margaret and Daniel can figure out something new. Something that honors what we were without pretending the last 25 years didn't happen." He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen that smile. The one that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "I'd like to try," he said. So they tried. It was messy and complicated and sometimes painful. Margaret was used to control, to having answers, to building empires. Daniel was relearning how to be in the world, how to trust that the ground beneath him wouldn't disappear again. They argued about her need to fix everything, his reluctance to accept help. They negotiated boundaries and expectations. They moved slowly, but they moved forward. 6 months after their reunion, Daniel proposed a project. He wanted to design a shelter for homeless individuals, something that treated people with dignity, that offered not just a bed but a path forward. And he wanted Margaret to fund it, to use her resources and connections to make it real. It would be called the Blue House, after that first apartment they had shared. A place where people could find their way back to themselves. Margaret said yes without hesitation. Not because she was trying to assuage her guilt or because she was trying to buy redemption, but because it was right. Because Daniel's vision for the shelter was born from his own experience, from his understanding of what people needed when they had lost everything. And because building something together, creating something that would outlast them both, felt like the right way to honor what they had survived. The shelter opened a year later in the Bronx. It had 30 beds, a full kitchen, counseling services, job training programs, and a design studio where residents could learn drafting and architecture. Daniel ran it with the same quiet determination that had once carried him through prison and homelessness. Margaret served on the board and showed up every week to help however she could. The photograph, the one Daniel had carried for 25 years, hung framed in the main office. A reminder that everyone had been someone before they fell, and everyone could be someone again. They never did get married. Marriage felt like a piece of paper from a different lifetime, something that belonged to Maggie and Daniel but not to who they had become. Instead, they built a partnership based on honesty and work and the understanding that love wasn't about reclaiming the past, but about choosing each other in the present. On the 5th anniversary of the shelter's opening, they held a celebration. Former residents came back to share their stories. Board members gave speeches. The mayor sent a proclamation. And at the end of the night, when everyone had gone home, Margaret and Daniel stood in the empty common room, surrounded by the evidence of what they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked. "Not the shelter, but us. Coming back together. I derailed your life once. I don't want to think I did it again." Margaret looked at him, at the man who had survived the unsurvivable, who had faced her on a sidewalk with nothing but truth and a photograph. "You didn't derail anything," she said. "You reminded me what the tracks were supposed to be for in the first place." She had been Margaret Chun, CEO, untouchable and powerful and alone. Now she was still powerful, still successful, but no longer alone. She had found her way back to the parts of herself she had abandoned, the parts that Maggie had carried before survival demanded she set them down. The photograph still sat on her desk at Ashford Tower, a reminder that destiny was not a straight line but a circle, that sometimes the only way forward was to finally reckon with what you left behind. And on the streets of Manhattan, where Daniel Harper had once sat with a cardboard sign and a photograph, a man walked past the spot without noticing it. But a few blocks away, in the Bronx, 30 people slept in beds at the Blue House, warm and safe and working on their own circles back to themselves. Some stories, Margaret had learned, were not about happy endings but about honest ones, about facing the truth of what was lost and building something true from what remained, about recognizing that the person you were and the person you became could both be real, both be worthy, both be loved. She held Daniel's hand as they locked up the shelter for the night, and together they walked out into the city that had broken them both and given them the chance to rebuild. Not as they had been, but as they were. Together despite everything. Together because of everything. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was destiny finally recognized.